I always thought I was careful in the woods. I had been hiking for years since I was a teenager, and I never took dumb risks. I checked the weather, packed more food than I needed, carried extra water, a good knife, and a basic first aid kit. I never pushed myself past my limits, and I always stuck to the marked trails. That last part was important. People who wandered off trail were the ones who got lost, injured, or worse. I didn't want to be one of those people. But sometimes all it takes is one small mistake. This trip was supposed to be simple. Just 2 days alone in the mountains, a solo getaway to clear my head. I had picked a trail in a national forest, a 12-mile loop that climbed up through thick pine forest before opening up into alpine meadows, with a campsite near a lake at the highest point. The plan was to hike in, camp for a night, then take the loop back down the next morning. Nothing crazy. I set out early in the morning, my pack snug against my back, my boots solid on the dirt path. The first few miles were peaceful, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I fell into a rhythm, my boots crunching against the packed dirt, my breathing steady. It was around mile 5 when I saw the side trail. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't marked. Just a thin path, barely wide enough for a single person, breaking off from the main trail and winding into the trees. It looked well-trodden, too clear to be an animal trail, but not maintained like the official paths. I stopped, frowning at it. I should have kept walking. Instead, I pulled out my map, double-checking the area. Nothing. No official trails, no old logging roads, just solid forest. But the trail was there, and it looked recent, like people had been using it. I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who went off-trail, but something about it bothered me. If it was an unofficial path, where did it go? A shortcut? A dead end? My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the main trail and onto the narrow path. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The deeper I walked, the more the sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. No wind, no birds, just my footsteps. The path itself twisted through the trees, curving unnaturally, like it was made to disorient someone. I kept going, my stomach tightening for no good reason. 15 minutes passed, then 30. I should have turned around, but I didn't. That was my second mistake. The trail sloped downward, the trees growing closer together, the branches hanging low. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air smelled different, like damp rot. The dirt beneath my boots turned soft, almost muddy. My instincts screamed at me to go back, but I had that hiker's stubbornness. I had already come this far. Might as well see where it led. Then I found the cabin. It was old, too old. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging, the door hanging open just a little. No signs of recent activity, no footprints, no tire tracks, no fire pit. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. Something was wrong with it. I could feel it. I don't know why I stepped closer. Maybe I wanted to see if anyone had been there recently. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. The air felt thick, humid. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in my ears. The door creaked when I pushed it. Inside, it was worse. The first thing I saw was the chair. Just a single wooden chair, sitting in the center of the room. Nothing else, no furniture, no bed, no stove. Just that chair. And the walls. The walls had scratches on them. Hundreds of them. Deep, uneven gouges, like someone had raked their fingernails across the wood over and over. Some marks were old, faded with time. Others looked fresh. Something moved behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. But there was nothing there. Just the trees outside, swaying slightly. The light was dim, like the sun had suddenly dipped lower in the sky. I needed to leave. Now, I backed out of the cabin, my pulse hammering. I turned, ready to follow the path back to the main trail. But it wasn't there. The trail was gone. I spun in circles, searching for it. I had just walked in from that direction. There should have been a clear path. But all I saw were trees. Thick, dark trees, pressing closer than before. My breath came in quick, uneven gasps. I wasn't stupid. I knew panic would make things worse. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had a compass. I had my map. I could get back to the main trail if I stayed calm. I turned west, the direction I had come from. I pushed through the trees, branches scraping against my arms, my legs. I walked for 10 minutes, then 20. Then I saw the cabin again. I stopped dead. My brain refused to understand what I was seeing. I had walked away from it. I had been going in a straight line. And yet there it was. The same sagging roof, the same open door, the same chair, sitting in the middle of the room. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged. I tripped, hit the ground hard, scrambled up, kept going. Then suddenly the trees thinned. I stumbled onto solid ground. The real trail, the marked, official trail. I stood there, gasping, looking around. The sun was higher than before, the air cooler, normal, the way it should be. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I hiked out of there, faster than I ever had in my life, barely stopping until I reached my car. I never found that trail again. I checked maps, asked other hikers. No one knew about it. No one had ever seen an old cabin in those woods. But I know what I saw, and I know that if I had stayed any longer, I wouldn't have made it back. I was heading east on I-15, just outside of Las Vegas, pushing through the quietest hours of the night. The clock on my dash read 3:02 a.m. The desert stretched out in every direction, dark and empty, with nothing but low hills and scattered shrubs breaking up the land. A full moon hung in the sky, casting just enough light to see the edges of the road without my high beams. The radio had given up miles ago, only catching bits and pieces of static, so I was driving in silence, listening to the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the steady rumble of my engine. I had been following 3 black SUVs for the past hour. They weren't speeding or doing anything erratic, just cruising along at a steady pace, a few car lengths apart, like they were moving together. What caught my eye at first were their plates. Nevada tags, but not normal ones. Just single-digit numbers in sequence, 1, 2, 3. That wasn't something you saw every day. I'm not one to get nosy about other drivers on the road. People drive all sorts of weird cars at night, and I've learned not to overthink it. But something about these SUVs bugged me. They looked identical, blacked out windows, no visible markings, nothing to say if they were government, private security, or something else entirely. And they weren't passing or slowing down, just keeping their steady pace like they were in no hurry. I kept my distance, staying back but not far enough to lose sight of them. Around 3:20, without any warning, all 3 SUVs flicked their turn signals on at the exact same time. I didn't see a sign for an exit. There were no streetlights, no markers, not even a worn path in the dirt, just open desert. But they turned anyway, right off the highway, onto what looked like nothing more than loose gravel and sand. And then, as soon as they were off the road, their lights shut off completely. 1 second they were there, and the next just black shapes in the desert, swallowed by the night. I felt my stomach tighten. There was nothing out there. No buildings, no power lines, no sign of a ranch or a business. Just dirt and silence. And yet, those SUVs had turned like they knew exactly where they were going. I kept driving. I told myself I didn't care what they were doing. The desert was full of weird stuff. Military installations, private airstrips, even secretive rich guys who bought up land to do God knows what in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't my problem. I was just a trucker hauling freight, trying to get to my next stop without trouble. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I checked my mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights appear behind me again. Nothing, just darkness. The further I got from that turnoff, the more the back of my neck itched. About 15 minutes later, I spotted a rest stop sign. I wasn't tired, but I wanted to pull over for a minute, stretch my legs, maybe splash some cold water on my face. The turnoff was a half-mile ahead. I flipped my signal on and eased off the highway. The rest stop was empty. A couple of vending machines sat near the entrance, buzzing under yellowed fluorescent lights. There was a single sedan parked near the bathrooms, but I didn't see anyone around. I climbed down from my cab, stretching my arms and rolling my shoulders. The air was still warm, even this late at night. I leaned against my truck and looked out over the highway, half expecting to see those SUVs again in the distance. But the road was empty. I let out a breath and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was making too much of it. Maybe it was nothing. I decided to grab a drink from the vending machine. I walked over, dug a couple of quarters out of my pocket, and pressed the button for a bottle of water. The machine whirred, the bottle dropped, and I bent down to grab it. And that's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. A few feet away, leading from the edge of the rest stop toward the vending machines, were fresh boot prints in the dust, the kind left by thick-soled military or tactical boots. I stood up slowly and looked around. The rest stop was dead silent. No wind.
No rustling bushes.
Nothing. The footprints were deep, like whoever made them had been walking with purpose. But they stopped near the vending machine, like someone had stood there, watching. I felt a tightness in my chest. I glanced back at my truck, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing out in the open. I turned quickly and walked back, climbing into the cab and locking the door behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, listening to my own breathing. Then I checked my mirrors again. Nothing. I reached down, put the truck in gear, and pulled out of the rest stop, getting back onto the highway as fast as I could. For the next hour, I kept checking my mirrors, watching the road behind me. But I never saw those SUVs again. By the time the sun started creeping up over the horizon, the whole thing felt like a bad dream. But when I stopped for fuel later that morning, I got out and checked the dust on my truck. There were more footprints, right by my driver's side door. That was the last time I ever stopped along that stretch of highway at night. I had been camping solo for years, ever since I was in my early 20s. Something about being out in the wilderness, away from the constant hum of civilization, made me feel grounded. It wasn't about adventure or pushing my limits. I just liked the quiet, the long stretches of silence, the smell of pine and damp earth, the distant sound of running water from a stream or lake. That year, I decided to camp out in a remote part of Montana. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I found on a topographic map. A clearing by a lake, miles away from the nearest road, nestled between rolling hills and thick forest. It looked perfect. No tourists, no RVs, no campfire smoke from families roasting marshmallows. Just me, my tent, and the wild. The drive took most of the day. I I parked my truck on the side of an old service road, unloaded my gear, and started hiking in. The trail was barely a trail at all, more like an old animal path that had been reclaimed by the forest. I had my GPS, a compass, and a paper map, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I'd done this plenty of times before. By late afternoon, I reached the spot. It was even better than I expected. A flat patch of ground near the lake, shaded by tall pines. The water was calm, barely rippling, reflecting the pale blue sky above. No signs of other campers, no trash, no broken branches from someone setting up before me. It felt untouched. I set up camp the way I always did, tent first, then the fire pit. I collected some dry wood, stacked it neatly, and made sure I had enough for the night. Once that was done, I sat by the lake and ate a quick dinner. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air cooled the way it does in the mountains, and I pulled on a jacket. As the light faded, I started a small fire. I wasn't the type to sit around it telling stories or getting lost in thought. I just liked the warmth, the way it kept the night from creeping in too close. The forest was quiet, aside from the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Normal sounds, squirrels, maybe a deer moving through the trees. Nothing that put me on edge. But as I sat there, something started to nag at me. A feeling, the kind you can't explain. The kind that settles in your gut and makes your skin prickle, like being watched. I'd had it before on other trips, but it always passed. Usually it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the darkness, the way the trees seemed to press in when you were alone. I shook it off and focused on the fire. It wasn't like I was in bear country, at least not heavily. I'd taken precautions, kept my food sealed tight, and hung anything with a scent far from my tent. If anything was out there, it wasn't after me. The feeling didn't go away, though. At some point, I heard something, a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, not far off, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the woods. I looked up, firelight flickering against the trees. Could have been anything. A raccoon, a fox, even a bird landing on a dead limb. But then there was another snap. Closer this time. I stood up, scanning the dark. My flashlight was in the tent, but I didn't want to go fumbling for it. Instead, I grabbed a stick from the fire and lifted it, letting the glow stretch further into the trees. The underbrush was thick, shadows shifting with the light. Nothing moved. I waited, listening, my ears strained against the quiet, but the forest had gone still. Not even the insects were making noise anymore. After a minute, I lowered the stick and tossed it back into the fire. I told myself it was just an animal passing through, probably spooked by the fire, stopping to watch me the way animals sometimes do. Still, the feeling lingered. I let the fire burn down to embers before climbing into my tent. Zipped up the flap, laid down, and listened. The silence was heavy, but I forced myself to relax. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up to something outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just the faintest sound of movement. A shuffling, slow, deliberate, right outside. I didn't move. My first thought was a bear. But bears don't move like that. They don't creep. They don't hesitate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it at the tent wall. A shadow moved, not an animal shape. Person. I shot up, heart hammering. I wasn't armed, not with a gun anyway, just a knife in my pack. My mind raced through options. Make noise? Stay quiet? Then the zipper moved. Not fast. Slow. Testing. I lunged forward and slapped my hand against it, shoving it back down. My pulse was a drum in my ears. Silence. Then footsteps. Walking away. Slow, unhurried. I waited until they faded completely. Then I unzipped the tent, just enough to peek out. The fire was still smoldering, casting a dull glow. The trees stood silent. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed up. Fast. Didn't bother with breakfast, didn't take my time. My hands were shaking as I shoved everything into my pack. As I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something. Footprints. Not boots. Bare feet. Leading from the treeline. Stopping right at my tent. Then turning back. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. I hiked out faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. Didn't look back until I was on the road, miles away. I never reported it. What would I even say? But I never camped alone again. I had planned the hike for weeks. It was supposed to be an easy solo trek. Just me, the mountains, and a simple weekend escape. Nothing crazy. No deep wilderness. No off-trail exploring. Just a straightforward loop through the forest, following well-marked paths. The kind of thing hikers do all the time. I packed light. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, enough food for 2 days, and just enough water to get me to the next refill point. Everything was checked and double-checked. The weather forecast was perfect. No storms, no extreme temperatures. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. The trailhead was about a 3-hour drive from my apartment. I left before sunrise, reaching the parking lot just as the sky started turning orange. There were a few other cars there, but I didn't see anyone around. That was fine. I liked the solitude. I locked my car, threw on my pack, and set off. The first few miles were exactly as expected. Birds chirping, the distant sound of a river, the crunch of my boots on dirt. The air smelled fresh, pine and damp earth. Everything felt right. I had no reason to believe this hike would be different from any other. The first day passed without trouble. I made good time, stopping only to filter water and eat a quick lunch. The trail was well maintained, mostly flat with a few rolling hills. It was easy hiking, exactly what I wanted. By late afternoon, I reached my planned campsite, a small clearing next to a slow-moving creek. I set up my tent, boiled water for dinner, and sat on a fallen log, watching the sky darken. I didn't see a single person all day. That struck me as a little strange. This was a popular trail, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just an off-season lull. That night, I slept deeply. No strange noises, no nightmares, just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. The second day was supposed to be just as easy, a longer stretch, but nothing technical. I planned to reach my next campsite by late afternoon, leaving plenty of time to rest before the final stretch back to my car. The morning started fine. The trail remained clear, the scenery beautiful. But then, a few hours in, I noticed something strange. A footprint. It was fresh, bigger than mine. A heavy boot print, deep in the dirt. Someone had passed through recently. That shouldn't have been weird. I was on a public trail after all. But something about it unsettled me. The problem was the print was alone. No others leading up to it. No others continuing ahead. Just one, pressed deep into the earth, as if someone had stood in that spot for a long time and then disappeared. I stood there for a moment, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sounds except the wind and birds. I shook it off and kept walking. A few hours later, I stopped for lunch, found a flat rock, took off my pack, and ate a protein bar. I took my time, enjoying the silence. Then I noticed it. Something was off. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I didn't realize how loud my own breathing was until I tried to hold it. I listened. Nothing. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing but dense forest in all directions. Then I saw it. A shadow. Far off the trail, deep in the trees, a figure just barely visible between the branches. Not moving, not making a sound, just standing there. I stared. My heart pounded. It wasn't an animal. I blinked. The figure was gone. I didn't waste time. I threw my pack on and kept moving. Faster now. I didn't look back. For the next few miles, I felt it. Not saw, not heard. Felt like something was watching me. Every so often, I'd glance back. Nothing, but the feeling never left. The hairs on my arms stood up. My stomach stayed tight. My body knew something was wrong, even if my brain tried to rationalize it. I wasn't alone. At some point, I passed a wooden trail marker. According to my map, I was still on the right path, but it felt wrong. The trees looked different, denser, the ground rockier. I should have recognized this section, but I didn't. I kept walking. I should have turned around. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. The air felt heavier, like I was moving through something unseen. I should have reached my campsite by now, but I hadn't. I checked my map again. It didn't make sense. I'd followed the trail exactly, but nothing matched what I was supposed to be seeing. I was lost. Panic started creeping in. I forced myself to stay calm. I had supplies. I had a GPS. I just needed to backtrack. Then I heard it. A footstep. Not mine. Close. I spun around. Nothing. But the feeling was stronger now. That awful, gut-deep certainty that something was watching me. I kept moving. Fast. My legs burned. My breath came short. I just needed to find the trail again. Then I saw it. A tent. Not mine. Old. Torn. Sitting in a small clearing, half collapsed like it had been abandoned years ago. The air around it felt wrong. I didn't go near it. I didn't even stop. I just walked faster. The sun started setting. I had to find shelter. Finally, I spotted a flat patch of ground. No choice. I set up my tent, forcing my hands to stay steady. I ate without tasting my food. The forest was too quiet again. I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent, staring at the thin fabric walls, listening. Every tiny sound made my heart jump. At some point, exhaustion won. My eyes shut. Then, a sound, a breath, close, right outside my tent. I froze. No footsteps, just breathing. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the zipper, not being pulled, just touched. A slight movement. I clenched my knife. Silence. Minutes passed. An hour. Then, footsteps. Slow. Leaving. I waited until sunrise before I unzipped the tent. Nothing there. But in the dirt right outside, a single boot print. I ran. I didn't care about food, didn't care about rest. I just moved. Fast. The trail still didn't make sense. But I kept going. Kept pushing forward, lungs burning. Then finally something familiar. The wooden trail marker. I almost sobbed. I ran past it and suddenly the trees felt normal again. The air, lighter. Birds chirping, like I had crossed an invisible line. 2 hours later, I saw the parking lot. My car. I didn't stop until I was inside, doors locked, hands shaking. Only then did I look back. The trail was empty, but I knew something had been out there, and it had watched me leave. Hiking had always been something I did to clear my head. I wasn't reckless, but I enjoyed pushing myself, going deep into the wilderness, where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That was the appeal, the quiet, the solitude. This trip was supposed to be just another one of those. A 3-day solo hike through a remote canyon in the desert. No marked trails, no crowds, just me and the open landscape. I had planned every detail. I had studied the maps, packed extra water, brought my GPS and a paper map as backup. I wasn't expecting to get lost. I wasn't expecting to find something that shouldn't have been there. Day 1, I parked at the trailhead early in the morning, stepping out into the cool desert air. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. I strapped on my pack, adjusted my gear, and set out. The first few miles were easy, the ground mostly flat, dotted with low shrubs and dry riverbeds. The canyon walls rose in the distance, towering cliffs of red rock, cut deep by centuries of wind and water. That was my destination. By midday, I had descended into the canyon. The air was hotter down there, the walls rising high on either side, blocking most of the wind. It was quiet, the only sounds my own footsteps and the occasional bird echoing off the rock. I followed a dry stream bed, navigating around boulders and patches of loose sand. The plan was to hike deep into the canyon, find a good place to camp, and then explore some of the side passages the next day. Everything was going as planned, until I found the footprints. They were faint, half covered by sand, but they were there, barefoot, and they weren't human. The shape was wrong, long, too narrow, the toes splayed in a strange way. I crouched down, running my fingers over the edges. Fresh. Within the last day or two, I glanced up, scanning the canyon around me. Nothing, just rock and silence. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had found a decent spot to camp. Flat ground, some natural cover from the wind. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and sat with my back against a boulder, watching the light fade. The silence felt different now, heavier. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside my tent. A shifting of sand, a soft, deliberate movement. But every time I listened, there was nothing, just silence. Day 2, I woke up early, feeling uneasy but determined to finish what I had planned. I left most of my gear at camp and set out to explore one of the side canyons. It was narrower than the main path, winding through high walls of rock, the sky barely visible overhead. An hour in, I found something strange, a structure. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw it wasn't natural. A rough shelter built against the canyon wall. Small, maybe 5 feet tall, made from stacked stones and dried mud. It didn't look old. Someone had built this recently. I stepped closer, my pulse picking up. The entrance was low, just a dark opening in the rock. I hesitated. Then I noticed something near the entrance. Pile of bones, picked clean, sun-bleached. Some were animal, small skulls, ribs, but some were bigger, too big. I turned and left, moving fast. I didn't run, not yet, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached camp, the sun was sinking. I packed my things, my hands moving quickly. I wasn't staying another night. I started hiking back, pushing myself hard. I could make it to the canyon entrance by morning. Then I heard it, a sound behind me, soft, footsteps in the sand. I didn't turn around. I kept moving, faster. The sound kept pace. Then I smelled it. Rot, thick and sour. I walked faster, my breath coming short. My heart was hammering. Then up ahead, something moved. A shape stepping out from behind a boulder. Tall, thin, watching. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't stop. Not when I tripped. Not when my legs burned. Not when the canyon walls seemed to press in around me. I ran until the sun rose. Until I saw my truck in the distance. Until I was safe. I don't know what I saw in that canyon. I don't ever want to find out. had always preferred hiking alone. There was something about being out there, deep in the woods with no one around, that made me feel like I had stepped outside of the world for a while. I liked the silence, the feeling of being totally untethered from the rest of my life.
No sedulis, no conversations, no expectations.
Just me, the trail, and the sound of my own footsteps. That's how I ended up hiking a remote trail in Montana late one afternoon, pushing further into the wilderness than I probably should have. I had been on a road trip for a few weeks, moving through the northern states, camping out when I could, staying in cheap motels when I couldn't. I had spent most of my time on well-traveled trails, places where I could pass other hikers every so often and feel like I wasn't completely alone. But that morning, I had stopped at a small gas station on the edge of a town I barely remember the name of, and the guy behind the counter told me about a trail a few miles out. "No one really goes up that way," he had said. "Not because it's dangerous, just kind of out of the way." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. So I drove out there, found the unmarked dirt lot he had mentioned, and set off into the woods with my pack strapped tight to my shoulders. It was perfect at first. The trail was well maintained but clearly not heavily used. The trees were thick, towering overhead, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I could hear birds, the distant rush of a stream somewhere off to the right. It felt like I had stepped into another world. I should have turned back before it got dark. I had planned to hike out about 4 miles, then loop back before the sun set. But the trail was beautiful, and I kept pushing forward, telling myself I would turn around just after the next bend, then just after the next clearing. Before I knew it, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I was farther from my car than I had meant to be. I wasn't worried yet. I had my flashlight, extra water, and a small knife clipped to my belt. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, even in low light. I knew what I was doing. At least I thought I did. I was about 2 miles from my car when I first noticed the silence. Not just quiet, the total suffocating absence of sound. The birds had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant rush of the stream was gone. I stopped walking. The woods felt heavy, like they were pressing in around me. I held my breath, listening hard, trying to pick up anything. An insect buzzing, a branch creaking, my own heartbeat. Nothing. That was the first time I felt it. That slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right. I turned my flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Everything looked the same as it had before. Just woods, just the trail, just me. But the silence lingered. I started walking again, a little faster now, my boots crunching against the dirt. It was the only sound in the world. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest came back to life. A bird chirped. A breeze rustled the leaves. The distant stream was there again, whispering through the trees. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But I picked up my pace anyway. About a mile from my car, I saw the first footprint. It was right there in the dirt, just off the side of the trail. Deep, clear, recent. It wasn't mine. I stopped, shining my flashlight over it, my stomach twisting. It was a boot print, same as mine, but bigger, wider, and it was pointing perpendicular to the trail, as if someone had stepped out of the woods, paused, then stepped back in. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept walking. The second footprint was even fresher. This one was right in the middle of the trail. My throat went dry. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. No one had passed me. No one should have been this deep in the woods at this hour. I swept my flashlight along the ground, looking for more prints. There were none, just that single boot print pressed firm into the dirt. I took a step back, my body tense. My heart was beating too fast now. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch, somewhere off to my left. I swung my flashlight in that direction, my pulse hammering. The trees stood still, thick and unmoving. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. After a long moment, I forced myself to keep moving, my legs stiff, my breath tight in my chest. I was almost to the car. I just needed to get there. The last stretch of trail felt endless. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping the beam along the ground, watching for more footprints, for movement, for anything. The silence had returned, thick and absolute. Then, finally, I saw it, the dark shape of my car sitting in the dirt lot up ahead. Relief flooded me. I was almost there. And then, just as I stepped off the trail, I caught one last thing in the flashlight beam. Another boot print. This one was different. It was facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I walked straight to my car, yanked the door open, and got inside, locking the doors the second I was in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, my headlights flooding the empty lot. Empty, but I didn't wait. I pulled out fast, my tires kicking up dust, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't breathe properly until I was miles away. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who made those footprints. Maybe it was just another hiker, though that seems unlikely. No one parks at that trailhead. No one hikes out there. It's too isolated, too empty. I keep thinking about that last footprint, the one facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting. And I wonder how long had they been out there, and how close had they gotten without me knowing.